order of operations. So for us to solve problems that involve multiple things that are going on, like multiple operations, as we could say, right? So as we can look at the example 1, there's multiplication and a subtraction and an exponent. And if you go about this in whatever order you want, or that I want, we may not get to the right answer. So there is an order of operations to lead us to the right answer. And those steps are below. So if we look at this, we have P, E, and then MD, and then AS. So what does that kind of stand for? Well, it could go for please, right? Like we'll think of a saying to remember all of this. Excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Well, what does that actually mean in terms of math? Because that can't be math. And it's not. So the please is going to be for parentheses. The E, or excuse, right, it's going to be for exponents. The M and D stand for multiply, divide. And the A and S stand for add and subtract. So it means that we need to look at this order in order to solve. So when we look at the first example, well, the only parentheses we have is this right here, right? It's just 1 over 5. And so there isn't really any operations inside the parentheses, so we don't need to go ahead and deal with anything there. So we can just go ahead and say we did that part, right? There's nothing to be done, so we can move on. Now we look at exponents. Well, we can see we have an exponent. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Now, when we have 1/5 raised to the second power, right? So if we have 1/5 raised to the second power, right? What does that actually mean? Well, it means that we have 1/5 times 1/5. That's what that means. And so we just would multiply what's on the top, right? 1 times 1, and we multiply what's on the bottom, 5 times 5. So what does that become? Well, we get 1 times 1 is 1, 5 times 5 is 25. So we get 1 over 25. So let's go ahead and rewrite this whole thing over here now. We're going to go 5 over 6 times 3 over 5 minus 1 over 25, because we just went ahead and just did that right here. Now let's go on. So we've dealt with our exponents. The next thing is we need to multiply or divide. So we're going to go ahead and tackle this first. Well, when we look at this, right, if we're going to go ahead and do that, we notice that we have a 5 and a 5. So let's go ahead and just take care of that. That can just become 1, and that can just become 1, right? Because 5 over 5 is just 1. So we can just, right, we'll cancel out from across, right? So now we have a 3 and a 6. Well, if we go 3 divided by 3, that's 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So 1 times 1 is now 1. 2 times 1 is 2. And then we have minus 1 over 25, because that's what we still have to do, right? So we dealt with this step, and now we just need to go ahead and subtract. That's the only thing we have left to do. So notice we have 1/2 minus 1 over 25. So they are not, right? We don't have a common denominator, so we need to go ahead and solve for that. So we could go on this side, we could go ahead and just multiply 2 over 2. And then on this side, 25 over 25. And so when we do that, right, we're going to get to a common denominator of 50, because the least common denominator between those two would be 50, right? Because 2 can't go into 25, and the next number would be, right, for 25 would be 50. So let's go ahead and now solve. So we would multiply what's on the top, right? And then we multiply what's on the bottom. That was a really bad color. Let's do green. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have 25 times 1 is 25. 25 times 2 is 50. Minus 1 times 2 is 2. 25 times 2 is 50. So 25, right, so we have 25 minus 2, right, because we only subtract what's on the top, and then we keep our denominator. So we have 50 on the bottom, but 25 minus 2 is 23, and that's over 50, and that would be the reduced fraction, right? We can't reduce it anymore. Example 2, we're going to solve for the following. So let's go ahead and just rewrite this so we know the order we do. So notice we have, right, the parentheses, right, which can be also absolute values are considered part of the step. And so we can kind of see parentheses here, but there's no actually operations that we have to do, so we're going to ignore that one first. But we're going to go ahead and deal with this one first, because that would be our parentheses step. So we're going to start with that. So we're just going to rewrite everything. Now, in the absolute value, we have 1/8 minus 1/4. So in order to get 1/4 to have the same, right, as this 8, we're just going to go ahead and multiply 2 over 2. Right, it's just multiplying it by 1 essentially, and so it doesn't change the value. So that's why we can do it. So let's go ahead and now rewrite everything with that. So we have 1/8 minus 2 over 8. So what do we get? Well, we get, right, if we were just to show, like, take this out. So let's go do it a little bit like right here, right? So we have this 1/8 minus 2 over 8. So we get negative 1/8, but it's an absolute value, so that just becomes positive 1/8. So that's our first step we would do. So we dealt with everything inside the parentheses, so now when we rewrite this, we can go positive 1/8, because we've gotten rid of the absolute value because we just made whatever it was inside, right, positive. So now we're going to deal with the exponents. That would be our next step. So we're going to go ahead and deal with, right, this would be our next step. So let's go ahead and do that. So 1/2 times 1/2, so we multiply what's on the top, and you multiply what's on the bottom. And I'm just doing this on the side, so it just doesn't become a really long process, but you can always do however you like. But I will run out of room if I do it like this, if I continue to like write it all out below. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4. So we have 3/4 plus 1/4 divided by 1/2, and then we have 1/8, right? And we're going to multiply that together. So now we've dealt with our exponents, so our next step would be to multiply and divide, and we just go from left to right. So that means we're going to deal with this first before we go ahead and multiply. So, right, because that's our first operation as we move left to right with the multiplication and divide. So now we leave 3/4, right? We're just going to drop it down. Now 1/4, and then, right, divide by 1/2. So we can just make that actually a multiplication. So that's 2 over 1. And I'm going to drop that positive sign. So we'll just leave it like that. So now we still need to deal with this, but, right, and so what we can do is this becomes a 1, and that becomes a 2, because we can take out a whole factor of 2. So we have 3/4 plus 1 times 1, that's 1. 2 times 1 is 2. And now we're going to deal with our last step in the multiplication divide step, right? And we're going to deal with this here. And this is a multiplication, right? Because they're right next to each other. So what does that become? Well, we get 1 times 1, so that's 1. 2 times 8 is 16. Now, our final operation would just be to add. And so in order to add, we need this to become the same denominator, right? So the quickest way would be to take this 4 and make it a 16. So we just go ahead and multiply it by 4 over 4. Doesn't change the value. So what does that all become? Well, 4 times 3, right? That's going to become 12. 4 times 4, well, that's 16 plus 1 over 16. And so that becomes 13 over 16, and that would be our final answer.